The FBI put Jack Kerouac under surveillance because of a single book that parents nationwide tried to ban. A book written during a 3-week drug binge that would inspire an entire generation to abandon everything and hit the road. In 1951, Kerouac fed a continuous 120-foot scroll of paper into his typewriter and, fueled by Benzedrine and black coffee, typed non-stop for 3 weeks. What emerged was a single, unbroken paragraph that would become one of America's most dangerous novels. The scroll itself has become legend. Like today's viral content creators who break every rule to go viral, Kerouac taped together sheets of tracing paper to create one enormous, uninterrupted surface, then fed it through his typewriter like a player piano roll. For 21 days and nights in April 1951, he sat at his desk in his mother's apartment, chain-smoking, popping Benzedrine tablets, and typing with manic intensity. No paragraph breaks, no chapter divisions, no stopping to change paper, just pure, unfiltered consciousness flowing onto the page at breakneck speed. In today's world of endless scrolling and social media addiction, Kerouac was essentially creating the first literary equivalent of a TikTok binge. The Benzedrine didn't just fuel his writing, it nearly destroyed his mind. By the second week, Kerouac was experiencing violent hallucinations, seeing shadowy figures in his peripheral vision and hearing voices that weren't there. His mother, Gabrielle, would find him at 3 a.m., wide-eyed and trembling, convinced that government agents were watching the house. The drug caused severe paranoia and anxiety attacks that left him gasping for breath. His hands shook so violently from the stimulants that he could barely hold his coffee cup, yet somehow he kept typing. The physical toll was devastating. He lost nearly 20 pounds during those 3 weeks. His eyes became bloodshot and sunken, and his speech became rapid and incoherent. Gabrielle later told friends she thought her son was having a complete mental breakdown. When he finally finished, Kerouac had created something unprecedented, a 125,000-word novel written as a single, breathless sentence. Publishers didn't know what to make of it. "This isn't a novel," they said. "This is typing." One editor famously complained that the manuscript couldn't even be edited because there were no paragraphs to work with. For 6 years, the scroll gathered dust, while Kerouac struggled to find someone brave enough to publish what would become On the Road. But when Viking Press finally released the book in September 1957, it exploded across America like a cultural bomb. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more shocking. This was the height of the Eisenhower era, when conformity was king and the American dream was defined by suburban houses, steady jobs, and nuclear families. Sound familiar? Just like today's pressure to follow the perfect Instagram life, post-war America demanded total conformity. Into this world of grey flannel suits and backyard barbecues came Kerouac's wild tale of young men abandoning everything to chase freedom across the highways of America. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. The New York Times called it a historic occasion, but many critics were horrified. The San Francisco Chronicle denounced it as a road to nowhere and accused Kerouac of glorifying delinquency and promoting anti-social behavior. Religious leaders condemned the book's casual attitude towards sex, drugs, and authority. Parents worried that their children would read it and immediately drop out of college to hitchhike to California, the 1950s equivalent of today's fear that social media will ruin young people's lives. Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York called it a handbook for moral degeneracy and urged Catholic bookstores to refuse to sell it. Reverend Norman Vincent Peale declared from his pulpit that the book was a poison that will corrupt the minds of our youth. In Chicago, a group of concerned mothers organized book burnings in church parking lots, throwing copies of On the Road into bonfires while singing hymns. The American Legion passed a resolution condemning the book as un-American propaganda designed to undermine traditional family values. One school board in Texas actually hired private investigators to find out which students owned copies, threatening suspension for anyone caught with the book on school property. PTA meetings across the country featured panicked discussions about how to protect our children from this literary menace. They weren't entirely wrong. Within months of publication, On the Road had become the unofficial Bible of American youth rebellion. College students across the country began planning their own cross-country adventures, inspired by Kerouac's promise that somewhere out there on the American highway lay authentic experience and spiritual freedom. The FBI began monitoring Kerouac and his associates, convinced that the Beat movement represented a threat to American values and national security. FBI agent John Francis monitored Kerouac's mail and phone calls for over 3 years, convinced that the Beat movement was connected to communist infiltration. The Bureau's files on Kerouac eventually grew to over 500 pages, documenting his every public appearance and cataloging the names of everyone who attended Beat poetry readings. Agents followed him to coffee shops in Greenwich Village, photographed him at jazz clubs, and even infiltrated his social circle with undercover operatives. The FBI was particularly concerned about Kerouac's friendship with Allen Ginsberg, whose poem Howl had also been banned for obscenity. Agent reports described Beat gatherings as subversive meetings designed to corrupt American youth and promote anti-government sentiment. The surveillance became so intensive that Kerouac began to suspect his phone was tapped, which it was. One FBI memo suggested that On the Road might be written in code, with the cross-country travels actually describing communist escape routes. What those early readers didn't know was that the wild adventures in On the Road weren't fiction. They were barely disguised autobiography. The character of Dean Moriarty, the book's manic, charismatic anti-hero, was based on Neal Cassady, a real person whose larger-than-life personality had completely transformed Kerouac's understanding of what it meant to be alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into classic literature, hit that subscribe button. We're exploring the stories behind the greatest books ever written, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Kerouac first met Cassady in 1946, when both were hanging around Columbia University, part of a loose group of writers and intellectuals who would later be called the Beat Generation. Cassady was unlike anyone Kerouac had ever encountered, a working-class kid from Denver who had spent time in reform school, stolen hundreds of cars, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to talk non-stop for hours about everything and nothing. Where Kerouac was shy and introspective, Cassady was explosively extroverted, a force of nature who seemed to live entirely in the present moment, like someone who had deleted all social media and decided to live completely offline. Cassady's criminal resume was legendary among the Beats. By age 16, he had already stolen over 300 cars, using a technique he claimed could get any vehicle started in under 90 seconds. He once stole a Cadillac from outside a police station just to prove it could be done, then returned it with a full tank of gas and a note apologizing for the inconvenience. During one cross-country trip with Kerouac, Cassady drove 110 miles per hour through a Colorado blizzard while simultaneously reading a philosophy book, smoking a joint, and carrying on 3 different conversations with passengers. He crashed 5 cars in 1948 alone, but somehow always walked away without serious injury. Friends called him impossible to kill. He survived falling asleep at the wheel dozens of times, once driving straight through a roadside fruit stand and emerging from the wreckage laughing and covered in oranges. His most notorious stunt involved stealing a car in Denver, driving it to New York in record time, then abandoning it in Central Park with a bouquet of flowers on the dashboard and a love poem tucked under the windshield wipers. Between 1947 and 1950, Kerouac made several cross-country trips with Cassady, experiences that would form the backbone of On the Road. These weren't leisurely vacations, but frantic odysseys driven by Cassady's restless energy and hunger for experience. They would drive for days without sleeping, surviving on Benzedrine and coffee, racing from New York to San Francisco and back again in stolen or borrowed cars. Cassidy drove like a madman, talking constantly, seducing women in every city, and introducing Kerouac to a world of jazz clubs, drug dealers, and midnight conversations about God, sex, and the meaning of existence. For Kerouac, these trips represented something profound, a complete rejection of the safe, conventional life that post-war America offered to young men. Instead of settling down in the suburbs, they were choosing perpetual motion, authentic experience, and what Kerouac called the holy goof, a kind of sacred foolishness that revealed deeper truths about American life. It was the 1950s version of quitting your corporate job to become a travel influencer. But what Kerouac didn't know was that his hunger for escape would nearly destroy him. Jack Kerouac was born Jean-Louis Lebris de Kerouac in 1922 in Lowell, Massachusetts, to French-Canadian working-class parents. The defining trauma of his childhood was the death of his older brother Gerard when Jack was 4 years old. Gerard had been sickly and deeply religious, and his death devastated the family. Kerouac's mother told him that Gerard had been a saint, and Jack spent the rest of his life trying to live up to an impossible standard of spiritual purity while simultaneously rebelling against the Catholic guilt that haunted him. Despite his later reputation as a wild bohemian, Kerouac was actually a gifted student and athlete who won a football scholarship to Columbia University. But he felt increasingly alienated from the privileged world of Ivy League education, much like today's students drowning in debt and questioning whether college is worth it. After serving briefly in the Navy during World War II, he returned to New York determined to become a writer, but with no clear idea of what kind of writer he wanted to be. It was his friendship with Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs that introduced him to experimental writing techniques. But it was Neal Cassady who showed him how to live like a character in one of those experimental novels. The combination was explosive. Kerouac had the literary sophistication to recognize the significance of what they were experiencing, and Cassady provided the raw material of authentic American experience. The writing technique that emerged from these experiences was unlike anything in American literature. Instead of carefully planned chapters and polished prose, Kerouac developed a method of writing continuously, without stopping to revise or edit, following the natural flow of consciousness and memory. He wanted to capture the energy of jazz music, creating prose that moved like Charlie Parker's saxophone solos, improvised, emotional, and completely alive. The prose that resulted was revolutionary. Kerouac's sentences could run for pages, held together by commas and conjunctions, building momentum like a freight train rolling across the American landscape. He captured the rhythm of American speech, the slang, the energy, the desperate optimism of young people convinced that somewhere ahead lay perfect happiness and complete freedom. Consider this famous passage, where the narrator describes watching Dean drive. Yes, and it wasn't only because he was a sweet-gone character, but because he was a man and a brother, and his soul was in trouble, and his madness and his wildness were a part of the madness and wildness of the world, and they were beautiful and right. The sentence builds and builds, each clause adding emotional intensity, until it feels like the prose itself is racing down the highway alongside Dean's Hudson. Drop a comment below and let us know. What classic book changed your perspective on life? We read every comment and love hearing from fellow book lovers. When On the Road became a bestseller in 1957, Kerouac was unprepared for fame. He had spent years in obscurity, working odd jobs and living with his mother, convinced that the literary establishment would never accept his experimental prose. Suddenly, he was being hailed as the voice of a generation, like going viral overnight and having millions of followers thrust upon you without warning. The problem was that Kerouac had never wanted to be a spokesperson for anything. He was a deeply private person who had written about his experiences as a form of personal salvation, not as a how-to guide for rebellion. The constant attention made him increasingly uncomfortable, and he began drinking heavily to cope with the pressure. Interviews from this period show a man clearly struggling with unwanted celebrity, often appearing drunk or hostile when asked to explain his philosophy or defend his lifestyle. His television appearances became legendary disasters. On The Steve Allen Show in 1959, Kerouac showed up visibly drunk and could barely read his own work coherently. During a heated debate on William F. Buckley's firing line, he got so intoxicated that he started arguing with the cameras instead of Buckley, at one point standing up and challenging the studio audience to a fight. A 1968 interview on Firing Line showed him slurring his words and making incoherent political statements that contradicted everything his followers believed about him. He would often show up to college lectures so drunk that students would walk out in embarrassment. At one Harvard speaking engagement, he passed out at the podium and had to be carried off stage. The worst incident occurred during a poetry reading in San Francisco, where he began ranting about how much he hated hippies and told the audience they had completely misunderstood his work. By the mid-1960s, most venues refused to book him. Even more troubling was the way his book was being interpreted. Kerouac had written On the Road as a spiritual quest, influenced by his study of Buddhism and his search for meaning in a materialistic society. But many readers saw it simply as a celebration of hedonism and irresponsibility. The hippie movement of the 1960s adopted the book as a founding text, but Kerouac himself became increasingly conservative as he aged, eventually supporting the Vietnam War and criticizing the counterculture that claimed him as a hero. College students didn't just read about hitting the road, they actually did it. Within a year of the book's publication, Columbia University reported a 23% increase in students dropping out mid-semester with no explanation. Harvard Dean McGeorge Bundy received dozens of letters from students announcing they were leaving to find themselves on the American highway. Some of these adventures ended tragically. 3 Princeton students died in a car crash in Nevada while attempting to recreate Dean Moriarty's cross-country speed records. A Yale sophomore was found dead in a Denver flophouse, apparently from a drug overdose, with a copy of On the Road in his jacket pocket. The University of California at Berkeley began requiring students to sign waivers, acknowledging they had read warnings about impulsive life decisions inspired by contemporary literature. This contradiction between the wild freedom of his prose and the deeply traditional values he held in private life haunted Kerouac for the rest of his career. He continued writing prolifically, producing novels like The Dharma Bums and Big Sur, but none achieved the cultural impact of On the Road. He watched as younger writers like Ken Kesey and Tom Wolfe took his innovations in new directions, often receiving more critical acclaim than he ever had. The personal cost of his literary success was enormous. Kerouac's alcoholism worsened throughout the 1960s, and he became increasingly isolated and bitter. He spent his final years living with his mother in Florida, far from the literary world that had once celebrated him. When he died in 1969 at age 47 from complications related to alcoholism, many of his obituaries focused more on his role as a cultural symbol than on his achievements as a writer. But On the Road outlived its author and continued to find new generations of readers. The book's influence on American literature was profound and lasting. Writers from Bob Dylan to Tom Robbins acknowledged their debt to Kerouac's innovations in prose rhythm and his willingness to write about subjects that had previously been considered unsuitable for serious literature. More importantly, On the Road captured something essential about the American character: the restless energy, the hunger for new experiences, and the belief that somewhere beyond the next horizon lies the answer to all our problems. Every generation rediscovers the book and finds in it a reflection of their own desire to escape the limitations of conventional life and seek something more meaningful and authentic. The novel's enduring power lies not in its plot, which is relatively simple, but in its ability to make readers feel the exhilaration of complete freedom. Kerouac's prose doesn't just describe the experience of driving across America. It recreates that experience in language, making readers feel like they're passengers in Dean's car, racing through the night toward an uncertain but thrilling destination. Today's version of Hitting the Road looks different, but serves the same purpose. Van life influencers rack up millions of followers, documenting their escapes from corporate America, trading cubicles for converted Sprinter vans and Wi-Fi hotspots for mountain views. Digital nomads work remotely from Bali coffee shops, chasing the same freedom Kerouac wrote about, but with MacBooks instead of typewriters. The modern road doesn't require stealing cars. It requires only the courage to buy a one-way ticket and figure out the rest later. Today, more than 60 years after its publication, On the Road continues to inspire new generations trapped by social media algorithms and corporate expectations to question conventional definitions of success and happiness. In our age of digital distraction and curated lives, Kerouac's message feels more urgent than ever, that real life happens when we step outside our comfort zones and open ourselves to the unexpected adventures that await just beyond the familiar boundaries of our daily routines. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves great literature. Understanding the stories behind these classic books makes reading them even more rewarding. The road is still there, waiting for anyone brave enough to follow it. But here's what Kerouac never told his readers. He died at 47, destroyed by the fame he never wanted, while the freedom he wrote about remained forever, just beyond his reach. Maybe that's the real lesson. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from the people who paid the highest price to tell them. Thanks for joining us on this literary journey through one of America's most influential novels. If you enjoyed this deep dive into On the Road, subscribe for more explorations of the greatest books ever written, and hit that notification bell so you'll never miss our latest literary adventures. The world of great books is vast and full of surprises. Let's explore it together.